Yo, what's happening people, and welcome back to the channel. If you haven't been living under a rock recently, then you would have heard that Kendrick Lemar's just dropped his new album called Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, and it's absolutely fire. So in this video, I'm going to be making a beat in the style of that album. If you're new to the channel, then make sure that subscribe button's grey and click the bell next to it too, so you can be notified every time that I upload new content. Now with all that said, let's jump straight into it. So this album is extremely diverse in styles. A few of the beats feature some jazzy piano chord progressions, and there's also some mad sample type beats in there as well. One thing that I found the beats all have in common is that the bass lines are heavy and they tend to be the main focus of the beat. A lot of the beats from this album also use acoustic sounding drum samples rather than the digital samples that you'll hear in a lot of modern music. Older drum fills are used a lot for breaks and sometimes even as the main drum pattern for the track. Long story short, this album's got a wide range of different types of beats and sounds, but as always, Kendrick Lamar managed to piece it all together to create a seamless masterpiece. So in order to recreate a beat in this style, I first had to find a nice jazzy, soul sounding sample. And to do that, I just headed straight over to YouTube and searched for soul samples, and this is the sample that I found. Once I downloaded the sample, I threw it straight into Ableton, and this is the chop that I took from it. I'm going to be using this part of the sample throughout the whole track because the rest of it was quite drum heavy, which made it unusable. Originally this sample was in F minor, but the first thing I did was pitched it down by 5 semitones, which then brought it down to C minor. I then just made some cuts to the sample, so I had a few pieces to mess around with, and I had different sections to use for the verse as well as the hook. In fairness, this sample could have made a good track on its own with just some drums, however I wanted to throw some chords over the top. So I jumped straight over to Analog Lab and found myself a nice electric piano sound, and the sound that I chose is the FM like preset. And to get this chord pattern, I just figured out the root notes that I wanted and then went ahead and built them into triads. Then lastly, I just played these chords alongside the original sample and tried to figure out some top notes that I liked, and for that I just used my ear. And here's the progression that I came up with. Next, I wanted to layer this with another sound, so I went to the Stage 73 electric piano, again inside of Analog Lab, and for this I'm using the Good Vibes preset. And my pattern's the exact same as the first one, but just on a different sound. Here's how they sound together. Next, I just rendered these sounds down to audio and added them to a group. And the reason I'm doing this is 1, to save CPU, and 2, because I think that when you add effects to audio, it sounds a lot better than when you add them to MIDI. Then onto this group, I added an instance of Tape Mellowfy, and for this I used the Rhodes Warmer preset. Then to make it sound a bit more vintage, I used the Waves J37 tape plugin and went for the MHB bass preset. Next, I'm going to go over the drums. And like I said at the beginning of the video, a lot of the tracks from this album use acoustic sounding drums, so I pretty much exclusively use the Forbidden Fruits kit by Prod by Jack. This pack is full of some really nice sounding drum samples that match the style that I'm going for perfectly, so it was really easy to pick out some sounds that I liked. And here's how I made the drum pattern. I started off with a snare, and there isn't too much really going on here. I've just got my snares hitting on the 3rd beat of every bar. Then I'm just using my EQ to cut out all of the low frequencies below 200 Hz. For this beat, I'm using 3 different hi-hat samples to add a bit of bounce, so I'll just go over all of them one by one. So first off, I've got this short hi-hat sample that's hitting on every beat of each bar. All I did then was lower the volume of each second hit and also just move them off the grid by a small amount. Again, I'm using an EQ to cut out a lot of the lower frequencies, and I've also added a high shelf to introduce some brightness to the sample. Next, I went for this more open sounding hi-hat, and I've got this one hitting just before the snare. I'm mainly using this hi-hat to add a bit more bounce and make the whole loop sound less flat. And lastly, I chose another open hi-hat sample, and this one's got a nice sound on the tail end, which makes it sound like it's hitting twice. This one's hitting a lot more sporadically, and I pretty much just placed it down in all of the empty pockets to try and fill up the space. And those three samples together with the snare sound like this. Next up, I added a kick, and I went for a sort of boom bappy pattern with these large gaps in between each group of kicks. This is going to leave some space for those hi-hats that I just added, and you'll also see that I've moved some of these kicks off the grid to really get that swing that I'm going for. All I added to this was FabFilter Saturn, and I'm using the Magic BM preset. The last thing that I added to the drum layer is this nice fill sound, because I think it just ends each section of the beat really nicely. So the only thing that this beat is missing now is a nice catchy bass line. For this, again, I went to Analog Lab and I chose the Analog Saw bass preset. I then just played this riffing with my MIDI keyboard. I usually like to quantize my bass lines, but because my kick and some of my percussive elements are hanging off the grid, I left this exactly how I played it in. All I did then was made a very simple version of the bass line that I could use in the verses and the bridge. So I'll quickly let you hear the main bass pattern before I go into how I arranged it. So for arrangement on this, I kept it nice and simple to stay with that mellow, soul-filled vibe. I laid this beat out to have an 8-bar chorus, a 16-bar verse, then an 8-bar bridge that will bring us back round to the chorus. To make this first hook drop nice and hard, I'm using an auto filter on both the sample and melody groups, and I'm just washing this in throughout the intro. I'm then using this tape stop plugin that I spoke about earlier to create a dip just before the drop. This is going to allow the first bass hit as well as the kick to really shine. I'm using the kilohertz tape stop, however a lot of these plugins have the same parameters. I'm using a really long stop time, and I've always got my start time down at 0, so we're not taking anything away from the drop. In the hook, I've got all of the elements playing together and I didn't change anything. Moving on to the verse, I chose to completely take the kick out from the whole verse to allow the track to breathe a little bit and dip some of that energy. I also removed the snare from the first and second bar, leaving it to play only on the third and fourth. Then lastly, I just simplified the percussion a little bit by taking out the third hi-hat. Last thing I need to talk about is the bridge, and I kept this section really simple too. All that's playing here is the sample with one of my layers from the electric piano as well as some of the percussive elements. To make this build up a little bit, I've got an auto filter on my drum group, and this is just going to make that percussion sweep back in towards the hook. Then just before we loop back round to the chorus, I've got that drum fill hitting again. And that's pretty much it, so let's take a listen to the full beat. And that is going to bring us to the end of today's video. I really enjoyed making this one, so make sure to let me know in the comments whether or not I nailed the Kendrick Lamar vibe. If this is your first time on the channel, then do me a favour and make sure that subscribe button's grey. If you're still here at the end of the video, then massive shout out to you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.